Good to see you all again. So we're coming to the end of the month after this week. Already weird. And to continue talking during this Hispanic Heritage Month about Hispanic Americans who are on their way to sainthood, I'm going to talk about this woman, Venerable Maria Consuelo Soledad Sanjurjo Santos. Here's a picture of her, or here's a picture of her, and you can see her dates there, 1892 to 1973. So I guess she was naturalized as an American citizen, but she wasn't born, or she was born before the Congress gave Puerto Rican citizenship. Nevertheless, she became an American citizen. She was born in Arecibo, Puerto Rico. That's where she spent most of her, or a large portion of her life, born there. She died there. And she, as you can maybe see from her habit, she was a nun or a sister. And when she was 16, she joined the Servants of Mary, Ministers to the Sick. The Servants of Mary, Ministers to the Sick. Okay, so she entered the Servants of Mary when she was 16, and she spent the rest of her life as a nun. And she did a lot of things in her order. She was a good, holy woman. She was in the administration of her religious group, obviously serving the sick, I would imagine, because that was their ministry. But she also became the secretary and something called a conciliar of the group. I guess I don't know what the conciliar is, so I shouldn't say what it is. But she rose up in authority in the group, in the authority structure. And she was whatever that is, a secretary and conciliar for 10 years. But then she became, numero uno, or maybe I should say numero una. Became Mother Superior of the whole congregation. And she moved to Cuba, because that's where the headquarters of the congregation was, or of the group. So that's where she moved. And she stayed there for 40-some years, I guess as Mother Superior. And then she had a heart attack. So, you get old and stuff goes wrong. So she had a heart attack, and I guess she couldn't be Mother Superior anymore. So they moved her back to Puerto Rico to recuperate and live out the rest of her life, which she did, living a simple life of loving God and serving the group that she had joined, the sisters, the servants. She spent her time sewing clothes for the sisters, praying. I would hope so. I would hope so if she's a saint, talking to God, and assisting the sick. And she was a sister for 62 years, so a long time, most of her life. And she died in 1973 in San Juan, Puerto Rico again. And so there she is. She's on their website. She's venerable. She's on her way towards sainthood. In the second phase, venerable. They do have a saint for this group, Saint Maria Soledad, which can be a little bit confusing because it's like the same name almost, Maria Soledad. Maybe that's the name she took in religion. But she's venerable. They just call her Soledad Sanjurjo Santos. Okay. This is their website. If you want to see some of the nuns, here they are. They look like happy women. Taking care of the sick. Okie dokie. Good to see you all again. See where? Right? There we go. Okay. Jesus, ministry, and teaching. Jesus, ministry, and teaching. Okay. Hate the messages. Where did I end? All right, talking about some things we can know about Jesus of Nazareth, some historical information. I was talking about what we can know about his birth and his basic family, like his mom and dad, or who was believed to be his dad, but was certainly known to be his mother. Okay, I was talking about the fact that he was known to have been born in Bethlehem in Judea, the province of Judea, but that he grew up, or at least came from, the province of Galilee, this town Nazareth. Okay? And that's as far as we can go. If you ask most scholars, New Testament scholars, they will say that they don't think Jesus was born in Bethlehem. precisely because of the information I gave you in the last class. Because they're not, because there's that confusion about whether, Jesus' family was living in Bethlehem already or living in Nazareth. And a lot of scholars opt for that they were probably living in Nazareth and that Bethlehem was, I don't know what the mind's got. Whoa. All right. They opt for Nazareth because Nazareth had no cachet. Let's put it that way. Nazareth was like a town in the boonies. It was a nothing town. It was, it's not mentioned in the Old Testament. It's unknown outside of the fact that they're living there. Except for the fact that this guy Jesus came from it. This one of Jesus. There might have been another Jesus in the town as well. Who knows? But that Jesus came from it. Nazareth was not known very well. In fact, we don't even know what the name really was. I said Jesus of Nazareth, right? Is his name. But if you read, that's how they translate it in the Gospels. But if they really followed the Greek literally, you have three different forms of the name. In some forms, it's Nazareth, with the th at the end, T-H. In other forms, it's Nazaret. It's the T, which is a different letter. And in other forms, it's Nazara. 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 So, what was the name of the town he came from? Most commonly, he's called Jesus of Nazareth. But that just shows you how uncommon the town was. It wasn't, Nazareth. Who comes from Nazareth, Bethlehem, though, had a lot of significance for Jews because that was where supposedly the Messiah was going to be born, in Bethlehem, because it was associated with an ancient king named David. All right, so scholars kind of extrapolate, which would they make up? Jesus coming from a nothing town or Jesus coming from Bethlehem, the town of King David? It's guesswork, really. And it's based on your prejudices. If you don't believe in prophecy, or you don't believe, you don't think Jesus could have been born there, then you'll say no. I think what we can historically say is that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and that he grew up in Nazareth, but in the earliest Christian traditions we don't know why. And that's why I think it's probably historical. Against most New Testament scholars, because the Gospels can't figure it out. They try to, Matthew and Luke try to figure it out and give some reasons why that's so, but in the end they don't really work. So they know these things. They also know that Jesus was a carpenter. He was a woodworker. He's called that. In Mark's Gospel, if you look at Mark chapter 6, I think that might be the only place. No, Matthew, but Matthew might be... Yeah, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus isn't described as a carpenter. He's described as the son of a carpenter, which one might presume that he followed in the footsteps of his quote-unquote father. Okay. The word used is a tectone, which, I got it on PowerPoint. Tectone, which is Greek, and we know this word. We encounter it in words like architect, architecture and stuff like that, to builders, okay? People who, build things, which carpenters do. I prefer woodworker because that's more generalized, a generalized term than, not necessarily carpenter. Might be a little bit too specific. It's a broader term than just that. And so we know if Jesus were a woodworker, a carpenter, as the Gospels tell us, no reason they would have made it up, I don't think. And he wasn't a shepherd or a farmer or some kind of laborer, then we know something about his social status. We know from, for example, I looked in the Oxford Dictionary of the Bible, which is written by scholars. Excuse me, but I keep getting, I need this over, but I keep getting stupid messages from stupid people who should not be messaging. Not stupid people, but bots from my bank, telling me, money was taken out or money was put in. Sorry about that. Carpenters, we know, were of a rather low class. Their social standing was quite low. If you had to grade them, being a carpenter or a woodworker wasn't as bad as being a beggar on the street. That was kind of the lowest of the low. So you were above beggars, just above beggars, but you weren't as good as peasants, like small landowners. People who had a little bit of land, peasants. So you're right in that spot. A peasant was above a carpenter who was above a beggar, which kind of shows you that it was rather low on the totem pole. Not a lot of, when people heard Jesus, like people here today, oh, you're a GA or GC, you're a general contractor, you're an construction. Oh, wow, you're building stuff, building buildings, and people might be impressed, or you might have a television show on HGTV or something. Not in those days. A carpenter, and we see this, for example, in the Gospels, when people encounter Jesus teaching, one of the first reactions is, isn't this the carpenter from Nazareth? Which is even worse, he's a lowlife from a low-life town, or a nothing little town. So, and this is mentioned throughout the Gospels. Jesus did not, people, kind of pigeonholed him by that. And he didn't have necessarily the best reputation to begin with because of where he came from. Almost nothing is known about his childhood or his early adulthood. I'll skip over these two things. Almost nothing is known. We have one story about Jesus when he was 12. That's in the Gospel of Luke, but that's all we have really. There are other stories about Jesus in other quote unquote Gospels, Mr. Hinkle. Because people wanted to know, right? People wanted to know, what was Jesus like as a little boy? Well, people weren't, I guess in the movie The Chosen, Matthew was writing stuff down, but, I don't think Mary and Joseph were keeping records, keeping like your parents do, oh, his first doo-doo. And they get out a little bag and they put it, you got those little books, where you have cuttings of your hair when you were a baby. Your parents have any of these books of when you were a baby? They have your little wristband from the hospital, or they have cutting of your hair, and no? Your parents didn't save this stuff? Some of them, okay. Or they certainly, I would imagine, have videos somewhere along the way that they can show you. We don't have that with Jesus, as with most people from the ancient world. Nevertheless, stories do appear later on, written by Christians, because people wanted to know. And the church never accepted them. We'll talk about this more when we get to the canon in the Bible. They're out there. We know about them. You can read them online. But they're goofy, They're clearly seem to be made up. At least I don't think they're historical. They're made up. They might have some historical information embedded in them. But it seems more like people's imaginings, like what would Jesus have been as a 5-year-old? What would he have been as a teenager or something like that? And so, especially when, or what was he like as a baby? And some of the stories are kind of goofy, and the church rejected them, said this is not the Jesus we knew, or that we know of. So we don't really know much. And that's not the point of the Gospels. The point of the fact that we do have some stories in Matthew and Luke's Gospel, Matthew's and Luke's, that's great. But really, they're concerned about his ministry. His ministry. Ministry comes from the word ministere in Latin, which simply means to serve. Serve. Okay? And it's the act of giving a service. All right, that's it. Call it Jesus' ministry, but there's nothing religious about the term. All right? It's Jesus' service. All right? Jesus, as we're told only by Luke, he tells us that when Jesus was around 30, he began his ministry. He showed up in Galilee, where he was from, and started preaching a religious message, okay? Which was unusual because he wasn't a religious figure. He wasn't a rabbi. He wasn't a priest from the temple, or he was just a carpenter from this very small, I don't say undifferentiated, but there's another word I'm looking for. But I guess you know what I mean. A nondescript town, all right? Not a famous town or a notable place. But he shows up and he starts his ministry, his act of service, as it's called, all right? But again, it's just a word, all right? You can use it in different ways. So around 30, Luke tells us. 29? Was Jesus 29? Was Jesus 31? Who knows? Traditionally, people usually peg Jesus at the age of 30, right? That he begins, and then it's a 3-year ministry. Problem with that is that if you read the Gospel of Luke, who's the only one that tells us about the age of Jesus, Luke's Gospel, everything seems to kind of happen and tie up within a year. Very quickly. I mean, there's no, from what we can tell from any kind of sense of time that Luke gives us, Jesus starts in Galilee and almost immediately decides, I got to go down to Jerusalem. And the rest of a big chunk of the gospel is Jesus' journey down to Jerusalem where he's going to die. So how long was his ministry? We don't know. In the Gospel of John, where John does give us some indicators of time, he mentions Jewish feasts that occurred, that Jesus went to the temple for these feasts and stuff like that. That's where we get the idea of 3 years from. So Christians and tradition, this is the tradition. This is not based on anything, just a tradition, an extrapolation from the Gospels. Christians follow the Gospel of John and thinking that Jesus had a 3-year ministry. But the 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, seem to have just a 1-year ministry. But again, it doesn't matter how long it was. They just want to record stuff, these things about his ministry that they've selected. Okay? So Jesus begins his ministry. All right? And all the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, agree on the basic structure of telling the story. Okay? If you read the Gospel of Mark by now, please God, that's where she goes. Maybe, if you read the Gospel of Mark, this should be familiar to you. How did the story go? Well, Mark throws you right into it. Jesus actually doesn't even begin with Jesus, right? He begins with John the Baptist. John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, dunking people in water. So he doesn't even begin with Jesus. He begins with this person, John. And we don't know anything about who he is. Mark doesn't tell us anything about who he is. Just tells us what he's doing. He dressed like a prophet. Okay? He wore the uniform of a prophet, camel's hair and stuff like that. And apparently that's what, if you were a prophet, that's what you were supposed to wear. So anyway, he's, a prophetic figure for Mark. And he's saying that someone else was going to come after him. That he's implying that he's preparing the way for somebody else. He doesn't say who, though. So I don't know if he knew. John had some inkling, or he was just doing what he thought God wanted him to do, of preparing the way for some other figure. If he knew it was Jesus or not, I don't know. Nevertheless, it starts with John's baptism ministry. It follows with Jesus' ministry in the gospel of Jesus' teaching, healing, casting out demons. Okay? Also, I throw baptizing in there. We only get that from the Gospel of John. John's Gospel says that Jesus had a baptism ministry, which is interesting. The other 3 Gospels don't mention it. Then comes the Passion narrative. The Passion narrative, passio in Latin, comes from the Latin word patior, which means to suffer. I suffer. Which is, those of you who went to Catholic school will know, is a deponent verb, right, Mr. Closa? A deponent verb, which indicates anyone take Latin? Anyone study Latin? Oh, somebody studied Latin in college. Someone told me Latin. Is that you, Ms. Walker? No? I thought somebody said that. I thought it was a female told me that. Someone. Maybe not in this class. It's possible. Pasior. Passion. To suffer. A narrative. Narro in Latin means to tell a story. So it's a fancy way of saying the story of suffering, the story of Jesus' suffering, his arrest, when they beat him up, and whipped him, and then when he was crucified, he was nailed to the cross. So that's just a phrase used to describe this story of Jesus' suffering and death in each of the Gospels. And they all have them. In fact, they all seem to be leading up to them. In fact, one scholar, what was his name? Otto somebody. I should know because I put him in a footnote. Otto Michel? Well, anyways, doesn't matter. There's a famous statement by a German scholar that I think his name is Otto Michel, but don't quote me on that. That the Gospel of Mark is just a passion narrative with a long introduction. There's a passion there. That's what Mark is leading up to. The passion narrative is the important thing for Mark. Okay? Because right around chapter 8 already, halfway through the gospel, Mark starts pointing forward to the suffering of Christ, suffering of Jesus. And it's even more obvious in other gospels like John, where like from chapter 13, it's only 21 chapters in John, from chapter 13, already they're at the, Jesus enters, they're at the Last Supper. So the Passion narrative is quite important to the gospel stories. And then finally, they all end with the empty tomb. Maybe they have some resurrection experiences. That's all right. Drink it down, baby. You'll get that frog. Not necessarily resurrection experiences. Not all the Gospels necessarily originally even needed to tell stories about Jesus appearing. It was enough that it was the empty tomb. The tomb was empty. So where did the body go? Where was Jesus? Okay? So certainly empty tomb. Whether there were resurrection stories added on later, I'm not saying they're not true, but for example, in the Gospel of Mark, if you've read the Gospel of Mark and you've looked at the footnotes, you know that the stories of Jesus appearing to people after the empty tomb were added on by someone later. All right, they're fine. They're accepted by the church, stories. But Mark's gospel just really ended originally with this empty tomb. Jesus, who was killed, is not dead anymore. Where is he then? All right? Maybe you should go looking for him. You have to remember, the gospel writers are not just trying to record things, they're also artists in their own way. Each one is kind of an artist in the portrait they're painting. And Mark is not just trying to tell you details about Jesus accurately, but he also wants to lead you somewhere. Like, where is the body if it's not in the tomb? Make you start thinking about that. And then thinking back about what you read in the gospel. Notice how many times when you read the Gospel of Mark, the question of who Jesus is keeps coming up. Who is this guy? Who is he? The only people, I shouldn't say they're people, but they're persons. The only persons in Mark's gospel who recognize Jesus are the demons. I know who you are, Jesus Nazarene, the Holy One of God. I know who you are, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. Do not disturb us. And then pagans. The Roman soldier at the foot of the cross after Jesus dies looks and says, this was the Son of God. This was the Son of God. He recognizes him. People didn't. His own followers didn't necessarily recognize what he was. Later they will, but why does Mark tell you those things? Okay, so that's the basic structure of each gospel, the story of Jesus, okay? And it may be historical. It doesn't matter if it's historical. This is the way that, each gospel writer the church very early on decided to structure the story of how she was going to tell the story of Jesus. Okay? What he said, his words, and what he did, his deeds. Okay, obvious, Any historian deals with these things, George Washington, you deal with stuff that he wrote, stuff that he was supposedly said, you deal with what he did, And you talk about it, what's interesting, What's interesting about it. Any historical figure, Jesus is no different. We want to know, it's interesting to us what Jesus said. It's interesting to us what Jesus did. Okay? His word, and not just anything that Jesus said, like, someone sneezed and Jesus said, God bless you. Right? Just want to make it, it's like, it's just, the important things, the things that were meaningful was what is being recorded, his teachings especially. And not just anything that Jesus did, like, I don't know, Jesus had matzo ball soup for lunch today, like in The Chosen, right? Matthew's sitting there writing stuff down. Matzo ball soup. How many matzahs were in there, Jesus? Just one matzah, two matzah? Just one matzah. Jesus likes the one matzah. Two matzahs are a little too much for Jesus. No! Especially his miracles. They're not called miracles, they're called acts of power or signs. The word miracle is never used, maybe because it's too magical. People can misinterpret it, so they're called acts of power. Jesus has power. He's not just a magician. I shouldn't say not just a magician. He's not a magician, Ms. Miller. He's a doer of maybe you could say a wonder worker. He works powerful deeds or signs. And those are the focus. But the ultimate sign or the ultimate deed of power is Jesus' death and resurrection. Those are the ultimate miracles, his ultimate deeds that matter to the gospel writers. Okay. So, just go on. Yeah, okay. So this figure, John the Baptizer, literally that's what it is in the Greek, John the Baptizer, but I think that sounds weird to people, so that in translations they say John the Baptist, but it's not a denominational thing. It's not like Methodist or Catholic or, something. It means John the Baptizer. Okay, that's how he was known. He was an unusual character. He had a nickname. He shows up preaching a message in the wilderness and dunking people in water, and that's what was unusual about him. Yes, do Jews have ablutions? Yes. And if anyone has any Jewish friends or Jewish family, maybe your mom or your dad is Jewish or whatever, especially if it's your mother who's Jewish and she's observant Jewish, you might notice sometimes she goes to, a certain building, usually where the synagogue is, to take a bath. After the time of her month, her menses, or after childbirth or stuff like that, because blood is involved. There's an issue of blood in birth and also in menstruation, yes? So blood makes you ritually unclean. Ritually unclean. It doesn't make you, it's not a sin or something like that. It's an impurity, okay? Which needs to be washed away. So you wash it away with water. If you're a Jewish woman, you go to a mikvah and you baptize yourself. You dunk yourself in water, and then you are considered ritually clean, and you can participate again in the Jewish religious life. It's not just women. If I, a man, a Jewish man, touch a dead body, that also makes you unclean. Touching corpses or going to a cemetery, that makes you unclean. If I have a skin condition, eczema or leprosy or something like that, that could make me unclean. And once I'm cured, then I have to go to the mikvah and I baptize myself. But you dunk yourself in the water. The rabbi doesn't do it. Nobody does it for you. Okay? That's what made John unusual. He was taking the authority to dunk people down into the water of the river. So hence John the Baptizer. This was unusual. Look at there, Ms. Burris. Are those Cheetos or something? Or? Huh?
It's very hot.
It's hot? Ooh. You like hot food? Ooh. No, I'm fine. I'm just trying to gather my thoughts. I'm gathering my thoughts. There's nothing wrong with Boris. So it was unusual. It was unusual. That's why people gave him the nickname John the Baptizer, because that wasn't dunking yourself in water, being baptized or immersed in water was part of the Jewish religion and religious practice, but not having someone else do it to you. So this was an oddity. This was unusual by John, that he was doing this. So, baptism. And he does it to Jesus. Jesus, I mentioned that already. I'll do this, baptizo, before I move on. The word baptism just simply means to dunk. To dunk someone in water, baptizo in Greek. To immerse in water, immerse something in water, to baptize it. So dunking or plunging into water. Baptism. So Judaism had baptism. I mean, Christianity comes from Judaism. It's not reinventing the wheel. Jesus didn't reinvent the wheel. He was a Jew. So he knew of the practice of baptism, apparently, and took it as part of his ministry. Actually, kind of snitched it from John. That naughty Jesus, Mr. Tedeschi. Doesn't he know about copyright? Well, it raises a question. Why is Jesus going to John for baptism? And some scholars think that it's possible that Jesus may have started out as a disciple of John. We don't know. But Jesus was apparently present among John's followers. He was baptized by John, okay, and seems to have adopted some of John's practices like baptism. John had followers. Jesus went out and started getting followers of his own disciples. He started his own ministry, which curiously looked similar to John's. So we don't know, but some scholars think Jesus might have started out as a disciple. But he goes his own way. He starts his own itinerant ministry. Itinerant just means walking around places, Well, how else was he going to do it? They didn't have trains or cars. So he's walking around, starts in Galilee, apparently, his home place, and then moves down into the south, into Judea. As I already told you, was it a 3-year-long ministry or 1 year? We don't know. But Jesus himself starts going throughout Palestine, preaching his message, working deeds of power, miracles, especially healings, casting out demons, reconciling outcasts, hanging out with people who are in the outcast of society, lepers, sinners, people who are commonly considered sinners. He seems to be acting like a prophet, and he gains followers. He gains followers. All right? People start to follow him. Actually, if you read the Gospels, Jesus calls them. Again, that's very unusual. Talked about the 12 apostles. Jesus gathers the 12 apostles, yes? In fact, like the first thing Jesus does after he begins his ministry, like if we look at our Bible, turn to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. Chapter 1. Yes, the preaching of John the Baptist, the baptism of Jesus, the beginning of the Galilean ministry. It's in verse 14. Who would like to start reading Mark chapter 1, verse 14? Mr. Cummings?
After John was put in prison, Jesus went into Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God. Time has come, he said, the kingdom of God has come near. I believe the good news.
Excellent, sir. So we'll start there. Mr. Cummings, that first part where it says John the Baptizer had been arrested, where does Mark talk about that? Where does he describe that in chapter 1? From verses 1 to 14, yes, or 1 to 13. Okay, where does he talk about John being arrested? And for what? And for what? Why was John arrested? A little 5-finger discount at the local bodega, or John purloined a whatchamacallit bar? I got you. Okay, you're fine, sir. I got you. You're looking. Ms. Cottrell? Huh? Yeah. Where does Mark tell us about John being arrested and why he was arrested? Mr. Closer? He says he was arrested after John had been arrested. Okay. When did that happen? Verses 1 to 13. What do you think, Ms. O'Brien? God bless you, woman. God bless you. That's what you do. You look. Right, Ms. Villa? You take a look. All right, Ms. O'Brien, Mr. Cummings, Ms. Cottrell, Mr. Closer, I apologize. That was a little bit mean of me. Nowhere! Nowhere! He tells us nothing about John having been arrested. He just tells us now, after John had been arrested, Jesus came to... Oh, wait! John's been arrested? Why was John the Baptist be arrested? By whom? Who arrested him? What was the charge? What happened to him? Mark doesn't tell us. Mark just jumps right in. Because he probably knows that the readers of his gospel are Christians and know the story already. Later on in the gospel, he does insert the story. He's like, in between, he's telling another story about Jesus, and he's like, oh yeah, I guess I should tell you this. John, this is what happened to John. But he tells us this chapters later, when you're well into the gospel. So after John had been arrested, notice when Jesus decides to go out on his own, John has been put into prison. So I guess he decides to carry on the work. Jesus comes to Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God. What is the good news? This is the time of fulfillment, completion. Okay, the time is over. And I'll talk more, he's talking about the kingdom of God here, and I'll talk more about the kingdom of God in other later classes. But anyways, the reign, the rule of God has drawn near to you. So change, repent, change, and believe the message that he's preaching. Okay? So, I mean, the next thing, if you look at that, Mr. Cummings, what's the next thing that Jesus does after he begins his ministry? He proclaims those words. What's the very next thing he does?
You have some fish?
He what?
16 through 20.
Yes. What does he do? I got you, but he'll get it. Something about fish. You're on the right track, Mr. Cummings. He tells people to follow him. Is that what you were going to say, Ms. Walker? Yeah, he calls disciples, followers. Which, when you're reading the story, like any story, maybe we've read it or heard it so often that, it doesn't mean anything to us anymore. That's why, you want to try and read it slowly. Maybe look at some commentaries or something. You want to get into the mind of Mark and what he's trying to say here, because this is extremely unusual. A rabbi did not go out and get disciples. That might seem natural to us, And if you watch like any, film, on movies or television shows, you got some cult leader and sends the people out door to door, knocking, come join us, or Jehovah's Witnesses, knocking on the door. That might seem perfectly natural. It doesn't mean anything to us. Of course, Jesus goes out and he wants to get followers, right? He wants to have people that he can pass on his message to, right? Well, that's not how it worked in Judaism. The student chose the teacher. It was the student, the person who wanted to study Torah, study the law of God, who sought out who's the best teacher, who's the holiest teacher. And then they went and said, I want to be your student. And the teacher accepts them. Rabbis did not commonly go out and call their own students. It was very unusual. So the fact that Jesus is going out on his own, and the way he even speaks to them, I mean, in the translation it says, come after me and I will make you fishers of men. He says this to this man, Simon, and his brother Andrew, which right there is interesting, because Shimon is a Hebrew name. Andrew is not. Andrew's Greek. Andrew comes from Greek. So a Greek with a Jewish, or a Jew with a Greek name. That's rather interesting. Anyways, come after me. The Greek here that Jesus uses is like something you'd say to an animal. Get over here. Like you'd say to your dog. You know, when your dog has done something, get over here. It was like, get over here and I'll make you fishers. Not a fish, but we're going to fish people. And he does the same thing. Oh, he does other places where he says to Matthew, come after me. Get over here. Deute in Greek. So he orders them. It's a command. He commands them to become his followers. They have no choice. Jesus wants them. So followers, he starts creating. Jesus, look at this as creative. You know, it's not just like something just happened, like any sociologist might say, okay, you know, you've got this figure and, you know, charismatic figure. Jesus has charisma. People are attracted to him. They come to listen to him. And some of them want to stay with him to become his followers. Okay. That's not what the Gospels say Jesus was doing. He was making people follow him. He's creating something. A church. An actual community. It's not enough that they believe in him, or that he wants them to believe in him. He wants them to enter into his community, a real community of people. So he starts going and he starts calling people fishermen, which again, you know, the first people he calls are four fishermen, two and two brothers, Peter and Andrew, James and John. They're all fishermen. So they're businessmen. Doesn't mean they're dummies. They might be literate if they're businessmen. There's a lot of fishing going on at this. They call it the Sea of Galilee, but it's just a huge lake. I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures. It's a huge lake. It's called by other names as well, not just the Sea of Galilee. But yeah, we know that the fishing, as you might expect, was a big job, big deal there. But I mean, fishermen were like common people. He's not calling priests, he's not calling politicians or rulers, he's calling very common people, fishermen. And outcasts. Later on he calls Matthew, this man who's a tax collector, who the Romans had tax collectors all throughout the provinces to, tax people. You had to pay the toll. Like, you go over the bridge from New Jersey, well, not into New Jersey, but coming into Pennsylvania, right? They scan your license plate so they can make you pay the toll. Well, usually these people who had these contracts with the Romans to collect the tolls would always collect a little bit more over and above for themselves, because of course, it's just like the mob, skimming, the mob has to get their cut, otherwise you'll be sleeping with the fishes, coming back to the image of vision. You'll find your body in the Sea of Galilee, So the Romans needed their cut of the money, that's why they did take censuses of population to know how many people were there and how much they should be paid. But the tax collectors would add on to that for themselves, and so they were hated. So he gathers and gains followers. He also gains women. Women are following him, which is also very unusual in that culture. A woman was not to be unaccompanied except by, her husband or a brother, a male family member. That was for protective purposes, The ancient world was dangerous for women, just like it's dangerous still now, If you go out to a bar with your friends, you make sure that you leave with a friend, You leave with somebody else. You don't go out walking the streets of Philly at 2 a.m. alone. I mean, you can, but at least the safe parts, I guess you could. Are there any safe parts in Philly? But no less in the ancient world. So to have, and certainly a woman, safe or not, would not hang around with someone who is not related to her, either through marriage or blood. Because the question would be, well, why are you together? Well, what are you doing? Which I know people shouldn't judge, Ms. Miller. People shouldn't judge. But people also had enough common sense to know when you get boys and girls together and they get lonely or they get bored, and there was no TV, Ms. Wanamaker, no Hulu, no streaming. So what else should we do? What else could we do that's pleasurable and fun? I know. We'll play a game. Get out the Scrabble. So the fact that Jesus had all these women following around with him was also rather interesting and unusual. He did not, however, choose the women to be his closest followers. He chose 12 men to be his apostles, and to them he gives his teaching more fully. This, why 12? Well, the number 12 for a Jew would have some religious significance because there were 12 tribes of Israel. This man Israel, Jacob Israel, had 12, maybe. I mean, if you read the book of Genesis, he actually had more kids than the numbers don't work out. But like the Ten Commandments, it's a conventional number, The rabbis just, made it work. They fit all of Jacob's, he had a lot of children, okay? And they fit it into this 12 structure for some reason, because it had meaning to them. The number 12 had meaning. So the 12 sons or 12 tribes or family groups of Israel. So Jesus is a Jew. He knows this background. So he specifically chooses not 3 or 6 or 20 or 70 or 72. He chooses specifically 12. Which kind of gives an indication of what he's trying to do. He's trying to maybe restore the fullness of Israel, the 12 tribes, bring them back together in a way. And he sends his followers, these followers out. Okay, get to this in a moment. He sends his followers out to do things that he's doing. He gives them the power to work miracles as well. It's not just Jesus. They can raise the dead. They can cast out demons just like Jesus. Interesting. So Jesus is not really jealous about hoard all this power and authority to himself, all these things that he can do. He's generous, right? He's go out, heal the sick, raise the dead, just like I'm doing. I don't have to be there. Jesus is not like some egomaniac, megalomaniacal person. Miss Hoy. Yes, Miss Hoy, thank you. I'm sorry, but that's the 90s in me, Miss Hoy. No, Jesus shares. And notice in the Gospels, he doesn't teach them. Like, he doesn't show them how to work miracles. He simply gives them the authority. Oh, that's interesting. Because Jesus is a teacher, but it's not like a magician teaching his student, like, okay, you hold the card like this behind your fingers, and you have to do it like, move your finger like that. No, Jesus doesn't okay, this is how you exorcise a demon. He gives them the authority. And it's from him. It's not their own authority. They're casting out demons or working miracles in the name with the authority of Jesus that he gives them. So we start to enter into this question, who is this guy who thinks he can do this? This is not a normal Jew. He's not acting like a normal Jew. Okay. And because he doesn't act like a normal Jew, when people in, history, not just Jesus, but people like Socrates or other people don't act normal, they engender opposition. People might even want to get rid of them. And that's what happens with Jesus. Jesus entered into controversy with the Jewish leaders, the religious leadership, the people who knew the faith and knew that some of the things that Jesus was doing and claiming to be doing were maybe out of bounds for a Jew. A little bit scandalous. So, for example, he gets into controversy. For example, the religious leaders accuse Jesus of breaking religious laws. Okay, the most common one being the Sabbath observance, that, on Saturday, the seventh day of the week, according to God's law, and God is very clear about this throughout the Old Testament, that no work is to be done at all. No servile work, but anything that could even approach work was looked down upon. You could. There were some special exceptions in your home, obviously, but even then, you couldn't start a fire to cook anything. And even today, Jews, you couldn't travel long distances, a certain distance, because obviously you needed to travel to the synagogue for prayer, but not from town to town. They had certain specific distances, because then it becomes it's work again. You're going too far. So there are all sorts of rules of things you could do and couldn't do to protect this ideal of not working on the Sabbath. And Jesus was kind of free with that. I'm not saying that Jesus never, said, oh yeah, do what you want on the Sabbath, but he would give permission to his followers or people under certain circumstances if there was a need to do something on the Sabbath. And by his permission, they weren't breaking it. Well, that's interesting. Who is this guy? Where does he get off telling people they can ignore God's law? Or that he can give the authoritative interpretation? Because the religious leaders were the ones who gave the interpretation. They were the interpreters of the law, and you went to the rabbi or to the priest to receive instruction about how do you follow the law. And they would always, of course, be looking at, well, what does Moses say? And what is the traditions that we've received from the fathers about how to do this or how to observe this law? Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't appeal to Moses, the Bible, the scriptures. He doesn't appeal to any of the early Jewish fathers or authorities. He simply does it on his own authority. And that freaks them out, because that's almost, he's not saying he's God, but that's almost putting himself in the place of God. And saying that he can reinterpret a law which came directly from God, like the Sabbath law. They also thought that his moral behavior was scandalous. He'd hang out with people, he'd go out to dinner with them, he'd have a drink with somebody. Even people who were maybe on the outs, people who were considered sinners, or unclean, like prostitutes. Or people who were unclean, like lepers, people who had skin diseases and stuff. Or the tax collectors, who were seen as traitors because they would work for the Romans who were oppressing the Jews. So all sorts of people that he would break bread with that people didn't like. You can see that even nowadays, with the whole cancel. Well, it's now become I think it's become a cliche now, but cancel culture and stuff like that. Would you go to Applebee's with that person? I want to be seen dead in Olive Garden with Charlie Kirk when he was alive. Would you? Or Mamdani, I forget his first name. Who's the guy Mamdani, the socialist who's running for mayor of New York City? God forbid I'd sit down and have a drink with him or something. Or Donald Trump. How could you go there and visit? Bill Maher, a liberal comedian, went there and had dinner with him. How could you do that? You're a sellout. How could Jesus, a religious leader who's preaching who is preaching God's law. I mean, he's not like telling the prostitutes that, selling sex for that lust, perfectly fine. No, Jesus is very clear about lust, and it's not a good, he doesn't like it. And what he's doing is these people had converted, they had changed their lives, they were listening to his message and changing how they were living, but that wasn't good enough for some of the religious leaders. They were missing the point. All they were seeing was, well, I knew you when, It happens all the time, like when someone gets saved or something and they try to change, Maybe they're a drug addict or involved in the porn industry or something. And they find Jesus, Well, I knew you when you were in those films, you hypocrite. Yeah, I knew. I knew you when you were in the gutter, high, overdosed. Now you're a Jesus freak. Not fooling me. And it's kind of like the same attitude, They're not converting correctly, I guess. They're accepting Jesus, and that's enough. Again, they're going to Jesus and having their sins taken away. They're not going to the temple and offering sacrifices. They're going to the priests. Who is this dude? So his moral behavior and eating with them would make him unclean if he's eating with certain people. If he's eating with a person who's a leper who is not still a leper, although I would hope that Jesus would throw him a bone and, do a little healing before the meal or something. But if you're hanging out with people who are deemed unclean, having a meal with someone was a big deal in that culture because you're touching food together. Okay, you're drinking wine together. Drinking beverages together. So there's that intimacy of you're all touching and serving each other with the food. Okay? So if a person is already unclean or ritually unclean, for whatever reason, it doesn't necessarily even mean they're a bad person, but if they were ritually unclean, anything they touch becomes unclean. So all the food is. But Jesus doesn't care about that, apparently. So in a sense, Jesus is always, in their minds, like unclean. He's not observing the cleanliness laws that also come from Moses and from the fathers, the traditions of the fathers. So morally, he's bad. So people say, oh, he's a drunk. Jesus is a drunk. It's not just that he goes out and drinks wine with people, but he overdrinks, I don't think Jesus was a drunkard. They're just saying he's a drunk. Or he overeats. He's a glutton, So they make up these stories about him. Jesus, maybe this is a lesson for us today. We say things about people, and then things start getting kind of extreme, right? Jesus is not just a bad man in their eyes, or a troublemaker. He's an agent of Satan. He's possessed by a demon. He must be. Or he's insane. Maybe Jesus is just insane. He's out of his mind. He's crazy. But some opt for no, because they couldn't deny the miracles. They're like, the person who can't walk can now walk. Or the person who was deaf can now hear. They couldn't deny that, apparently. It was supernatural. But it couldn't be from God because Jesus was such a bad man in their eyes. So it must be Satan, the prince of devils. So Jesus is an agent of the devil. Or, as I said, he's just crazy. He's a madman. Either way, we got to do something about this Jesus, don't we? We got to do something about him. We can't just ignore him because he's gathering followers. He's manipulating the religion. And he's claiming to forgive sins. He's blaspheming against God. He's claiming authorities, things that he can do that only God can really do. Or at least God can do through his temple, Jesus can take away people's sins if they have faith in him. Faith in him. That didn't mean Jesus rejected temple worship. Jesus was at the temple all the time, apparently. Doesn't have a problem, apparently, with the temple. But he's now the source of forgiveness and reconciliation with God. So he's blasphemer. Blasphemy. Blasphemeo. Blasphemeo. To speak evil or profane words, usually about God or a spirit, religious. In other words, you take sacred things lightly. You don't show proper respect to the sacred. Okay? So Jesus is, even if Jesus meant something else by forgiving sins, like, I'm just acknowledging that you've reconciled with God or something, like it wasn't actually say, okay, I forgive you your sins. Maybe if you want to interpret it that way. It's still the sound of what he was saying was blasphemous because it was taking lightly a prerogative only of God. So he was a blasphemer. He showed disrespect towards God. And for that, the penalty was very clear. You had to die. There was no, just clear. The law of Moses, a person who blasphemes the Lord, and, judged to have done that, you die. And it's on you because you're a bad person if you're blaspheming God. So they're looking at what Jesus is doing and listening to what he's saying. And notice how many times in the Gospel of Mark records the objections of people, how can he speak with such authority? Who but God can forgive sins? And even more so in like the Gospel of John. So I love the Gospel of John. He reported, no, some people said Jesus was a good man. No, he's a bad man. But how can he work these miracles, You see the dissension, the disturbance that Jesus is creating. Now, on Jesus' part, he accuses those who are his accusers of hypocrisy. They're hypocrites. Hypocrites, a much overused word. I'll have to look at a thesaurus to find another one. Hypokrino, God bless you. Hypokrino. To judge up? I can't make that work. But anyways, to play a part, like an actor or an actress in a play. You're playing a part. You're faking. You're pretending. Okay, so actors are all hypocrites. They're pretending to be a character of some sort. And that's what Jesus is saying about his opponents. They were someone who pretends. Okay, they said one thing, okay, but their behavior, or they said something that they believed, but their behavior contradicted that. So yeah, they were big on the rules and observing this. Take one example, the Sabbath, resting on the Sabbath. But then they come up with all sorts of loopholes to really violate the Sabbath and do work on the Sabbath, but they all tie it up in a bow by, giving it some interpretation that works for them, rather than taking the law. So he's like, you don't even take the law seriously. So you're hypocrites, you're pretenders. You seem to be righteous, but really you're not. You seem to be good people, you look like good people, you talk the talk, but then when it comes down to treating other people well, you don't. He also faults them for not recognizing his authority. Again, who is this guy? Jesus never points to God. He talks a lot about God, but all the stuff he does, he never prays to God and says, God, do this for me, heal this person. He never says, he's not like a prophet who says, thus says the Lord, I have a message from the Lord, thus says the Lord. It's all on his own authority. And because they won't, the religious leaders will not accept his authority. Why should they? Who is this? Jesus, why? Why should we accept? You can imagine if you put yourself in their minds, it's like, what? This carpenter from Galilee thinks we have to all bow down to him. Now, who does he think he is? It's not the high priest. He's not even the Messiah or something. Maybe. Okay. So you have this kerfuffle going on between Jesus and the religious leaders. Not really, it doesn't seem amongst the common people. It doesn't mean everyone liked Jesus, but certainly some of the religious leaders from the Gospels apparently did follow Jesus. So it wasn't like a uniform or a united front against Jesus. Like all the religious leaders hated him. There were some who recognized him as a good man. But you have to recognize this because I think at least remember this because we have the story now, and we just kind of assume Jesus was this, great guy, loving guy, walk on the beach with you and talk and maybe carry you every now and then and, have a margarita with you and, hey, dude, that's okay, God's all right, God loves you, Jesus is kind of like this hippy-dippy, woke guy. And okay, some people loved Jesus and were his followers, but there are a lot of people who thought he was not a good man. He was betraying the religion. His teachings were, he was betraying the religion. And for that, he needed to be punished by God. If not by God, then someone had to intervene and do something about him. So Jesus was not well liked by everybody. And you need to ask yourself the question, why? Why was Jesus not well liked? Because if you watch the movies, it's like Jesus is whatever movie you watch about Jesus is great, right? Jesus is a nice guy. Jesus is lovely. And then you got these evil, mean-spirited rabbis and high priests who are calling for his death and stuff like that. Well, you can't assume that they were just bad people or mean-spirited. I mean, if I were back then and I were a religious observant Jew and I had some guy acting like kind of claiming authority for God, I'd be like, we haven't heard this before. Where's this coming from? Where's this in the scriptures? Where's this been passed down from the fathers? Yeah, maybe Jesus is a bad guy. Well, how can he work miracles? Well, maybe he is using magic or demons or something. That doesn't necessarily mean that people were in bad faith. They were truly disturbed. But Jesus was disturbing to people. He wasn't a normal guy. And you have to understand that, I think, to understand how he gets killed. Okay, so enter this guy, the Romans. Notice, this is all a Jewish affair. Okay, but the Jews were under the control of the Roman Empire at the time. Okay, so they didn't have their own government and they weren't able to manage their own affairs, at least not in Judea. Judea was under the control of a Roman governor or appointee named Pontius Pilate, who again we only know because of Jesus of Nazareth. He wasn't famous. Pontius Pilate was not a famous dude. We know him because of the story of Jesus. Anyway, this guy Pontius Pilate was the governor or the prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. So 10 years. What do we know about him? He is mentioned in some historical records, but we don't know where he came from, where he was born. We don't know when he died, where he was ultimately from. If we read the writings of our Jewish historian friend Josephus Flavius, and there's another Jewish writer named Philo who lived in Egypt, but Josephus mentions Pilate in his history. And the general agreement by these two dudes, Philo and Josephus, was that, Pilate was not a nice guy. He wasn't well liked by the Jewish population because, he would antagonize them. He would do things that would offend their religious sensibilities and would piss off the Jews, and there would be riots or there would be problems. So he wasn't considered a very nice guy. He liked to kind of let the Jews know who was in control. So he comes into the picture. If Jesus is guilty of a crime like blasphemy, the Jews couldn't condemn and kill him and execute him. The Romans would have to do it. They had the legal power. And so that's what they tried to do. Eventually the religious leadership, the Sanhedrin, which was the religious council that made all the religious decisions for Jews, not just in Jerusalem or in Judea, but throughout the world. Jews from out the Mediterranean would send questions to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. How do we how do we observe Rosh Hashanah in southern France? Yeah, or whatchamacallit, what is it, Shavuot? You know, when we can't get the proper palm branches or something like that, you write off a question to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, and the Sanhedrin would deliberate and then send back a response. So it was almost like the Pope in Rome. You know, you had the high priest in Jerusalem. So they arrest Jesus and they try him, and you know, Jesus says something. I'll get to that when I say why. I'll talk about why Jesus died. But Jesus apparently said something that confirmed for them that he was a blasphemer. He didn't think he was just a man doing a job for God, that he was maybe God himself, but certainly a blasphemer, and so he deserved death. And so he was handed over to the Romans. Okay? This is the famous Pontius Pilate inscription, which was discovered in northern Israel in 1961. Only in 1961. They were, what are they excavating? A theater or something? But anyways, and this, I think this was just taken from some other building, you know, reused and put as into the staircase or something. But anyways, the archaeologists found this and they saw that there was writing on it, and they noticed that, well, they recognized two of the names, Tiberium from Tiberius, the Emperor Tiberius, and then this guy, Pilatus. They see this name Pilatus, like, wait a second, we've heard that name before. And, I mean, you don't have his complete name, it's a little bit broken off, but you can tell it's Pontius Pilatus, because here we have the N, you have the T, okay? And, you know, translating this, and I thought I put it on this PowerPoint, but I guess I didn't. I had it on another PowerPoint. I thought I updated my PowerPoint. I give you the translation, but basically what it says is, this Tiberium, or building in honor of the Emperor Tiberius, that Pontius Pilate built and dedicated to the gods. So that's what it's basically saying. This, we can reconstruct it. This Tiberium, this building dedicated to Tiberius, Pontius Pilate had built and dedicated to the gods. Okay, so, you know, like a cornerstone, telling you this is when it was built and this is who built it. So he gets the credit for it, you know. He wants to show his devotion to the Roman emperor. So this is interesting. This is outside of the New Testament, until 1961, this is the only hard evidence we've discovered. It took until 1961 to find actual archaeological evidence that Pontius Pilate even existed. Until then, all we had were mainly the four holy gospels of Christianity, some scattered references in Josephus Flavius and this other Jewish writer Philo. That was, you know, and also some scattered minor references and some Roman office, just literary references. We had no concrete evidence that he was an actual person. Could have just been a made-up character in a story for all we knew. But then we found this. So that confirms, we can at least say historically that Pontius Pilate did exist at this time that Jesus was killed. And he seems to be the one that sentences Jesus to death, which I'll talk about on Thursday. God bless you all. Yes.
Question about the quiz.
Yes.
So it says that I got it.
Hold on 1 second. You keep going. I'm just gonna try to.
If it was about this one, you says like